Hi, we enter into the final section of Genesis today, beginning with Jacob's journey to Egypt, beginning in chapter 46. If you haven't watched the introductory video for this section, I encourage you to do so, where I go over things on the right side of the screen, including the relationship of all these various scenes, as well as what you see down here in the purple caption section here, with the three elements of what the book of Genesis accomplishes, and we'll look more at those as we go. So today we're going to be starting in this first scene here, and there's two little chiasms that take place. This first one framed by Israel or Jacob going out on his journey to Beersheba and from Beersheba, and then into Egypt with all that he had. And we'll look next time at the list of the names of the sons of Israel here and its parallels in Exodus and in the book of Numbers. So as we do, immediately we notice a couple of things. If we look at the map and get a sense of where we're going here, we're starting off here in Beersheba, and he doesn't know where he's going in Egypt yet. We know it's going to be Ramses, but he doesn't know that, in the land of Goshen, but he's just heading out to Egypt. And if we look at a Google Maps here, you can see here's leaving Beersheba, at least as much as Google Maps shows it today, and then just out into the desert. And although the map, the stylized map I show, has an arrow across the desert, it's really hard to imagine where they go exactly. But this text isn't concerned with the journey. The journey back to the promised land after the time enslaved in Egypt takes two whole books almost, the whole book of Exodus, most of the whole book of Exodus and the whole book of Numbers. But here, that's not the concern of the writer or narrator. It's narrated in the middle of one verse. What's of concern, as we'll see in this scene, is what Jacob does to prepare for this journey and what he takes with him in over against what Joseph told the brothers to tell their father, that he should rely on Joseph in Egypt. And I'd like to suggest that's not just a little coincidence. That's suggesting that Jacob already understands that it's dangerous to be relying on Egypt, and he's going to take care of himself. And we'll see more examples of that as we go. So right away, we see a couple of interesting things here. My note below has, from Westerman, as I was noting in the introductory video, I leave a number of notes of Westerman in my quick verse here so we can see them. We can also explore why they're not necessary anymore to see this as sources, and I went over that some last time. So he sees this in terms of form criticism as a series of different kinds of forms that are stitched together, but we don't need to see it that way at all. As the chiasm shows, it's all tightly organized. And then we see an interesting thing in this verse. When Israel set out on his journey with all that he had and came to Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. God spoke to Israel in visions of the night and said, "Jacob, Jacob." And so we see right away in this initial scene, Jacob and Israel back and forth, even in the same sentence. And then we notice something interesting. And you might not think of counting the names of people, but I was taught to do that early on, and we'll look in a second at how this echoes all the way back to Genesis 1. But what we can note in my note below, in these three key chapters, 46 to 48, which fit together nicely as a unit, Israel is 14 times and Jacob is 21 times. Together, that's 35 times, which is exactly half of the 70 people listed in the rest of the chapter. If we think that's just a coincidence, well, let's look back at Genesis 1, and you can see in the right column over here all the sevens that there are in this story. Not surprisingly, in a story that's based on 6 days and resting on 7, but it's not just the 7 days. It's water and light and day and life and all these other things. And then it continues beyond chapter 1. So we see in chapter 4 alone, Abel 7 times and Shem 7 times, which means name, etc. I won't go over all these again, but you can see how many of those there are. And so it's something that the biblical authors do, is invite that kind of close reading. In fact, when we get to the death of Jacob, we'll see how the number of years of the lifetime of Jacob and of Isaac and Abraham form a very interesting numerical pattern that only readers who bother to pay attention to those kinds of numbers make sense out of. And as I've been noting throughout, numbers throughout Genesis are symbolic. They're not literal counting devices, and that's the case here as well. So 7 times something is certainly highlighting the fullness of it. And what do we make of half of it? Well, you can decide for yourself. I won't presume to answer what numerical symbolism means without further help, but the context might help reveal it as we go. So when he set out on his journey, using the verb nis here, without the vowel, it's hard to pronounce, but in the form we have it as vaisa, used to mark major journeying, as we saw from Haran in the first place, and then separating from Lot, and then moving on after the second wife-sister story, and then Jacob separating out from Laban. And so we've seen that a number of times. This is, of course, Jacob's last journey. And he set out on his journey with all that he had. Notice it starts off just as if it's him, but when it's over, we'll hear that the entire family is with him. All that he had. And that runs directly contrary to Joseph's instructions. Let's go back a few verses to 45:20 and see, as Joseph instructing the brothers on what to tell their father when they got back, he says, "Give no thought to your possessions, for the best of all the land of Egypt is yours." And the sons of Israel did so. And Joseph gave them wagons according to the instruction of Pharaoh. And so we'll see in our immediate scene, the wagons are there, as you see in verse 5. But for whatever reason, Israel/Jacob has ignored the instruction from Joseph, who he's, of course, amazed to know he's even alive, to rely on Egypt for everything. Perhaps that's just because he doesn't trust empire. Perhaps he doesn't really trust it's real yet, but he's certainly carrying everything with him. We'll see how that may or may not change when he gets there and meets his son. And as we start this, we can only imagine what this is like for him. For all these many years, he thought that Joseph had a violent death, torn apart by animals, and when the brothers falsely brought his cloak that was covered in goat blood that they put on it. And now he not only finds out that he's alive, but he finds out he's the right-hand man to Pharaoh and all the nation of Egypt, where they've been getting food from. We can only imagine what this long journey that he's taking leads him to think about along the way. And I really think it's worth doing that, even though the narrator has it go out in just part of a verse, that this is a lifetime of reflection on his part. And we'll see a little bit later in this unit how the text offers those kinds of invitations to recall various elements along the way in Jacob's life. So he came to Beersheba, 7 wells, and we recall the previous times of Beersheba. We can see them on this chart that we've looked at before here, where Hagar departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba, and Abimelech and Abraham swore an oath at Beersheba there. And I won't go through all of these, but we can see it's been an important part along the way, finding water there. Of course, it means 7 wells. And here we get to our immediate scene. It's not done quite, and this is our end of our situation now. We'll see other situations in the monarchy story, when Elijah was afraid and came to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and Josiah defiled the high places, according to his reason for defiling them, from Geba to Beersheba. And so we see Beersheba has been an important place in the family journey and will continue to be later on. And that's where he comes for the first stop on his journey. And he offers sacrifices there, interestingly, to the God of his father Isaac, still not claiming his own God, even though we heard him say, "If you bring me back safely, I will make you my God." And now he's exactly come back safely, but he's not claiming it exactly yet. This scene that unfolds now will change that, maybe. So as we get to verse 2, as Westerman notes below, a highly stylized introduction in later language, one might wonder, later than what? Certainly the Joseph story is late, and the whole book of Genesis is exilic or post-exilic. And I've pointed out a number of times how the language of the Joseph story in many ways is different than the language of earlier parts of Genesis. But there's nothing particular about the language here that is later language. In fact, the language we hear, Jacob, Jacob, here I am, is almost exactly like Genesis 22. So God spoke to Israel in visions. This is the first time God is speaking since chapter 35. And that's really important, I'd suggest, because again, Joseph will say in the very end of the book that God has done all these things to bring you here and make you safe. But we can't underscore enough that there's no reported encounter between God by any name, whether that's Elohim or El Shaddai or Yahweh, with Joseph anywhere in this entire story. So like so many kings and leaders, he likes to talk about God being on his side, but we have no understanding as a relationship with God. But Jacob does, and we've seen it repeatedly, of course. So Jacob spoke to Israel. And one can ask there, is that at this point, is that speaking to Jacob, or is it speaking to the nation of Israel, which are beginning to merge together here? And that, of course, is the point of many of these chapters, to move from the individual sons of the one person to the people who we know as Israelites. So he spoke to him in visions of the night. I'm using the word marath here for vision. It's nowhere else in the entire Pentateuch. It's once in Job and once in Daniel and Ezekiel. This is certainly some of the late language that Westerman is talking about. But it's interesting. It uses the language of vision, and then repeatedly uses the verb of speaking 4 times in these 2 verses. And then we see the plural here of visions might relate to what Sternberg has helped me understand over the years, that when the narrator has repeated "and he said" in the midst of a speech, that's suggesting some kind of pause there. So perhaps there was multiple visions, and the first one is just the name, and the second one is the further response. We can't know for sure. Jacob, Jacob, echoing Abraham, Abraham, and Moses, Moses, and Samuel, Samuel. In the Abraham one in chapter 22, of course, it's there to save Abraham from having to kill his son, who he thought he was going to have to kill. And now, in this case, it's bringing Jacob back to his son, who he thought was dead and now is alive. And he answers, "Here I am," Hineni, and the first person pronoun for "here I am" is a number of times here for Jacob and several times for Yahweh, indicating the intense intimacy of this scene between them. And then God responds, "I am God, El, Anoki Ha-El." Anoki being the first person singular, like yo in Spanish, makes a formal beginning 3 times in these couple of verses and next in chapter 47. So really emphasizing who this is speaking. But it's not Yahweh. We don't hear anything about Yahweh in this section. "I am El, the El of your father," which of course matches Isaac up here, but without the name. "Do not be afraid to go down to Egypt." And we've seen "do not be afraid" a number of times, and this is not the last one. Here, the fear is not the general one of royal power, as we'd see in other situations, but the apparent risk to the promise of the land if Jacob continues to Egypt to see Joseph. And we'll see how, both in this vision that's dealt with, but also it's dealt with in the scene with Pharaoh, we'll see later. So not be afraid to go down to Egypt, recalling when Abram and Sarai went down in chapter 12, and Isaac and Rebekah in chapter 26, and this is recalled at Numbers and Deuteronomy, highlighting some of the time element that Numbers is certainly later than many of these stories here, although it's hard to situate Numbers as certainly composites. We won't go into that place. Also, as my note has, is divinely inspired call to leave land for a new one, parallel to these other traveling places there. And then God says, "For I will make of you a great nation there," not a people. And I want to highlight that because Israel is otherwise known as a people, as an im, not as a nation, the goyim, or sometimes translated as Gentiles in the plural or goy singular. A great nation there. And you'd have to read the Exodus story to see how we can make sense out of that, because of course we don't see it in Genesis, we'll only see it there. The anticipation of what God will do with people in Egypt also recalls what we saw with God speaking to Abraham out of a vision in chapter 15, where it anticipated that your descendants would be enslaved there for hundreds of years, but then would eventually be brought back to the land. So the second vision that promises if you go to Egypt, it's not going to be great, but it'll work out in the long run. "And I myself will go down with you to Egypt." And that might seem obvious that God is with them everywhere, but we have to recognize that in the exilic context of the main part of Genesis, monotheism was a new innovation as opposed to henotheism. We see that, for example, in Psalm 137, where the question is, how can we sing the songs of Yahweh in a foreign land? Understand that Yahweh, or El in this case, is the God of a particular place. So the idea that El will go with you to Egypt is not as obvious as it might seem to us, that the one God could be experienced everywhere. This is a God who travels with the people. And of course, if we know the Exodus story, we know that from the pillar of fire and the cloud that accompanies the people throughout the wilderness. "And I will also bring you up again." Anoki Aleka here. The personal pronoun I and the infinitive absolute surely bring up, make the statement very emphatic, as Wenham adds there. And I use the emphatic here. "I will bring you up." Yes, bring you up. "And Joseph's own hand shall close your eyes," or set your eyes. It's an interesting verb for close. We saw it in 3:15 for enmity between people in the Garden of Eden, for the appointment of Seth as a new child for Adam and Eve, as the sheep set apart when Laban and Jacob wrestled, so to speak, over the colors and spottedness of the sheep. Joseph set over the land, and here, and then finally the hands and heads switched on Ephraim and Manasseh there. So it takes place in the whole series of setting hands on various things. Joseph's hands are on Jacob's eyes to close them, while Jacob's hands will be on Joseph's sons to bless them. And so Jacob set out from Beersheba, literally stood up and went, and the sons of Israel carried their father Jacob. And we saw sons of Israel, Bnei Yisrael, 2 other times, but it's very quickly about to become Israelites. The new RSV, as we'll see next time in verse 8, translates what I leave as sons of Israel here as Israelites, There's no particular reason to switch it right now, but it's gradually becoming that. Here it literally is simply the individual son, so it's not expressing the larger collective reality that we see here, where the sons of Israel plainly are more than just the immediate sons, but include grandchildren. So they carried their father Jacob, using the same verb for setting out, their little ones here, their toph, and we see that a few other times, and their women in the wagons that Pharaoh had sent to carry him. So Jacob's willing to use the Egyptian wagons, but not to leave all his Canaanite things behind, which we see right here in verse 6, and we'll go down to verse 7 to see the rest of our immediate passage for today. As I note, my note below has, again, the journey itself is unnarrated, is irrelevant to the plot. So you take the livestock and the goods, a generic word, reshush here, which we see a number of times, that they had acquired in the land of Canaan, making a play on that, Rashu and Rashusham here. So the goods they'd gotten, one might say, in the land of Canaan. So it seems like all of it, and underscoring chiastically that it's all of it, and really making a point in this second chiasm to highlight just that. They took all their people, all their animals, all their goods, and before the sentence is over, came into Egypt. Jacob and all his seed with him. And verse 7 has a very interesting element, which you can't quite see in English, but you sort of can. So I provided the interlinear Hebrew so you can see sons, 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 daughters, daughters, sons is the sequence in Hebrew, and seeds, and all his seeds he brought with him. So it's as if Jacob was a farmer, bringing these young plants and a packet of seeds to go plant a family in Egypt. Is that what's going to happen? We'll have to wait until after the Litany of Names to see what happens when they arrive. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.